After more than 50 years of growing vegetables, I've learned something that took me a long time to accept. A hot summer isn't always the enemy of your garden. Sometimes it's a clue, because while your lettuce is bolting, your broccoli is getting eaten alive, and your beans are refusing to produce, there may be other plants sitting right beside them thinking, finally, the weather I was waiting for. And that's what I want to show you today. I've spent decades learning which plants struggle when temperatures climb, and which ones seem to come alive when the thermometer starts pushing higher. But here's the part most gardeners miss. You don't necessarily need to fight a hot summer. You can change what you're growing to work with it. And some of the plants I'm about to show you may completely change what you plant next year. Let's start with one of my favorites. 1. Sweet potatoes. If you've always thought sweet potatoes were difficult to grow, you may simply have been growing them in the wrong conditions. Sweet potatoes love warmth. They aren't looking for cool, damp soil. They want heat, sunlight, and a long growing season. I've watched them sit there almost doing nothing during cool weather, only to suddenly take off once summer temperatures arrive. The vines begin spreading everywhere, and that's when you know they're happy. But here's the payoff. If your summers are getting hotter, sweet potatoes may actually become easier to grow, not harder. One trick I particularly like is growing them in containers or raised beds that warm up quickly. Just make sure they have good drainage and don't allow the soil to become bone dry for long periods. And don't make the mistake of judging the harvest by what you see above the ground. The vines may look enormous, but the real treasure is developing underneath. Which brings me to another crop that practically asks for sunshine. 2. Okra. If you've never grown okra, a hot summer is a pretty good excuse to start. Okra is one of those vegetables that looks almost offended when the weather turns cool. Give it heat and sunlight, however, and it can grow with astonishing speed. In really warm conditions, the plants can become large, vigorous, and surprisingly productive. The important thing is timing. Don't rush okra into cold soil just because the calendar says it's time to plant. Wait until the soil has genuinely warmed. That's one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the years. The calendar is useful, the weather is more important. And if your summers are reliably hot, okra deserves a place in your garden. But we're only getting started. 3. Tomatoes. Now, tomatoes aren't exactly a secret, but here's what many gardeners misunderstand. Tomatoes don't hate summer heat. They hate extreme stress. A healthy tomato plant with adequate moisture, good soil, and plenty of sunlight can grow incredibly well during warm weather. I've seen tomato plants go from looking ordinary to completely loaded with fruit once summer really gets moving. The problem comes when the roots are constantly swinging between bone dry and soaking wet. That's when you start seeing problems. So instead of watering a little bit every day, concentrate on keeping the root zone consistently supplied with moisture and cover the soil. A good layer of organic mulch can make a remarkable difference by slowing evaporation and keeping the root zone more stable, which leads to one of the most important lessons in this entire video. In a hot garden, protecting the soil can be just as important as watering the plant. And there's another plant that absolutely loves being surrounded by heat. 4. Basil. Basil is almost the opposite of those cool season crops we talked about earlier. When the weather is warm, basil can become incredibly vigorous. Give it sunshine, warmth, and reasonably consistent moisture, and it can produce armfuls of fragrant leaves. But there's a trick. Don't wait until the plant is already flowering heavily before harvesting. Keep pinching the growing tips regularly. That encourages branching and gives you a bushier plant with more leaves. And here's something I love about basil. You don't need an enormous garden. A few plants can provide enough leaves for sauces, salads, pesto, and plenty of summer meals. But if basil likes heat, the next crop takes that idea even further. 5. Peppers. Hot peppers and sweet peppers both appreciate warmth. In fact, I've always found peppers become much more interesting once summer really gets going. The plants like plenty of sunlight, warm soil, and protection from cold temperatures. If you've had peppers sitting in your garden looking small and miserable early in the season, don't give up on them too quickly. Sometimes they're simply waiting. Once the soil warms properly, they can suddenly start producing new growth and setting fruit. And here's the interesting part. If your growing season is becoming warmer and longer, peppers may become one of your most reliable summer crops. Just don't let container-grown peppers dry out completely. Their roots have less soil to work with, so they can heat up and dry much faster than plants growing directly in the ground. Now let's move to a plant that can turn a small patch of ground into a jungle. 6. Squash. If you've ever grown squash during a hot summer, you'll know exactly what I mean. Give squash warmth, sunlight, water, and decent soil, and suddenly you've got leaves everywhere. Vines start moving across the garden, flowers appear, and before you know it, you've got more growth than you know what to do with. But here's the mistake I see gardeners make. They plant squash in a tiny corner and don't give it enough room to spread. Plan for its size before you plant. And if you're growing it vertically, provide a strong support system. A healthy squash plant isn't polite about staying where you put it. It will take whatever space you give it. And if you've got room for another vigorous summer crop, there's one more obvious choice. 7. Corn. Corn is a sun lover. It wants warmth, sunlight, moisture, and nutrients. And when those conditions line up, it can grow remarkably quickly. I've watched corn change dramatically in just a few weeks during the warm weather. But there's one thing you shouldn't ignore. Corn is thirsty. A hot summer can dry the soil faster than you realize, especially when the plants become tall and leafy. This is where mulch becomes incredibly useful. A thick organic layer on the soil surface can reduce evaporation and help keep moisture around the roots. And if you're growing corn, don't plant just a few scattered plants if you can avoid it. A block or several short rows usually gives you a better chance of good pollination than a single isolated row. Now, here's a crop that many gardeners overlook completely. 8. Amaranth. Amaranth is one of those plants that makes you wonder why you didn't try it sooner. It can handle heat, sunlight, and conditions that would leave some delicate vegetables struggling. And it isn't only useful as an ornamental plant. Depending on the variety, you can grow it for edible leaves or allow it to mature for its seeds. The plants can become impressively large, which means they also make a useful addition when you're trying to create more diversity in a heat-tolerant garden. And there's another reason I like unusual crops like this. They give you insurance. If one traditional crop struggles during a difficult summer, another crop may still give you something to harvest. That's an important lesson after 5 decades of gardening. Don't put all your hopes in one vegetable. 9. Cucumbers. Cucumbers love warmth, but there's a catch. They need water. A hot, dry summer can make cucumber plants look miserable surprisingly quickly. That's why I prefer to think about the soil before I think about the watering can. Add organic matter, cover bare soil, keep the roots protected. Then water deeply when necessary rather than constantly wetting the surface. And watch the plants closely. If the leaves wilt badly every afternoon, don't automatically assume they're dying. Some plants temporarily wilt during extreme heat to reduce water loss. But if they're still limp in the morning, that's a different story. Learn to read your plants. After 50 years, I can tell you that the garden will usually tell you what it needs. You just have to slow down enough to notice. And finally, there's one plant I would never overlook in a hot garden. 10. Melons. Melons are almost designed for summer. They want warmth, they want sunlight, and given enough time, they can reward you with something far better than anything you can buy in a supermarket. The trick is giving them a long enough growing season and keeping their roots supplied with moisture while the fruit develops. Don't drown them. Don't let them repeatedly go bone dry either. Keep conditions as steady as you can. And when the fruits begin developing, you'll understand why growing your own is worth the effort. The flavor can be completely different from the bland, underripe melons many of us are used to buying. But here's the bigger lesson I want you to remember. The future of your garden isn't necessarily about finding more ways to fight the heat. It's about learning how to work with it. If your summers are getting hotter, don't automatically keep planting exactly the same crops at exactly the same time every year. Experiment. Plant some heat-loving crops. Move cool season vegetables earlier or later. Use shade when necessary. Mulch heavily. Collect rainwater whenever you can. And most importantly, watch what actually happens in your own garden, because your garden is your experiment. Maybe your tomatoes suddenly perform better than ever. Maybe your peppers become enormous. Maybe sweet potatoes thrive where they never used to. Or perhaps you'll discover that one vegetable you've always struggled with suddenly loves your new summer conditions. That's valuable information. After more than 50 years of gardening, I've learned that the best gardeners aren't the ones who follow every rule perfectly. They're the ones who observe, adapt, and keep experimenting. So next time the temperature climbs and you see your lettuce struggling, don't assume the whole garden is doomed. Look around. Somewhere nearby, there may be a plant that's absolutely loving it, and that plant might be telling you exactly what your garden should look like next year. Now I'm curious about your garden. What's the one plant that absolutely thrives when summer gets brutally hot? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more practical gardening lessons built from decades of trial, failure, and success, stay with me, because there's always another garden secret worth discovering.